All right, so this is the recording of this last little bit of the study guide here. I'm speaking to a large group of people here, three faithful AMP students who are hanging out with me. We talked yesterday all about the behavior of the skeletal muscles, and we went through the 4 phases of muscle contraction: excitation, contraction, coupling, the contraction, and the relaxation. So we're on the back part of the study guide, and we're talking about behavior of the whole muscles. This is what we're dealing with now. So a couple of terms, and again, these are sections that I cut a bunch of pieces out. So there's a couple of terms to make you aware of. Twitch, a muscle twitch is a single stimulus that causes that cycle of contraction and relaxation. And it's a quick something, right? And it is when there actually has been enough stimulus to get over that threshold. And that threshold is that minimum voltage necessary to make an action potential in the muscle, to actually cause a contraction. So I think of it as, you know, when your parents or your guardian or somebody is saying to you, hey, do the dishwasher, and you don't really get up and do it. And then, hey, do the dishwasher. And if I say, Alex, get up and do the dishwasher, we finally got enough stimulus to get over the threshold of him getting off the couch and going and doing it. I can say that because he's here next to me. On figure 1114, before we go there, this is just a quick, just so you can see this phasing of how muscles contract. I cut this whole piece out, but the thought is, here is where you actually get the stimulation here. This is figure 1113, not 14. And there's this latent period where nothing is happening because we have to have that action potential diffusing through the sarcoplasmic reticulum to get down to the actual fibers themselves. So we call that the latent period. And then there's this contraction phase where the fibers are shortening, the muscle is contracting, it's actually working. So this is where you're building up that contraction. And then you have the relaxation phase. So it's not just a quick, simple off-on. There was this kind of wave to it. Again, there's lots more in the study guide that talks about how these muscles contract. This is figure 1114. That's basically showing you the more stimulus you get, the more of these nerve fibers are excited, the more of the muscle fibers are actually going to respond. So a little bit of stimulus, even sub-threshold, so no contractions actually happening unless you get this much stimulus. So 1, 2, there's no muscle contraction. There's just stimulation that's coming, but it's below the threshold. And then 3, 4, 5, that's where we actually start seeing tension building up in the muscle, actually getting it to contraction to occur. There are a number of these different kinds of contractions that we could talk about. The 2 basic types are isometric versus isotonic. Isometric means the muscle stays the same length, iso meaning same, metric meaning length. So the muscle length doesn't change, it doesn't shorten, but it tightens up. There's tension that's building there. Right. So isotonic has 2 different pieces, concentric and eccentric. I didn't have you all learn isometric versus isotonic. Isotonic means the muscle is changing in length. The tension is the same, isotension, isotonic, but there's actually length that's changing. And the 2 main types of lengths that we change, concentric is where the muscle shortens, and eccentric is when the muscle lengthens. So, great picture here, figure 1116. Isometric is, I'm holding this weight, I am not changing the amount of bend in my elbow, but the muscle tightens. That's isometric. Versus isotonic, concentric is doing elbow flexion, right? Biceps brachii and brachialis are contracting and flexing that elbow. Versus an eccentric contraction is where I am controlling how that weight is lowering down into extension. So it's still biceps and brachialis that are working. We're not talking about the triceps contracting to make it extend. We're just lowering that arm down, and that's what we call an eccentric contraction. Think about going down the stairs. As you go down the stairs, you have to control your body as you're moving down. That's an eccentric contraction of your quadriceps. Okay, moving into muscle metabolism. All muscle contraction depends on ATP. You must have ATP for muscles to contract. And your textbook does a job of kind of breaking it into this short-term and immediate and long-term, how you get these, the sources of this ATP. And this little diagram, figure 1118, I think does a nice job. They draw stick figures much better than I do, showing the different ways that we get this ATP. So immediately, for the short, immediate energy, we're talking about quick motion, like 6 seconds worth of sprinting, or you are doing heavy max rep weightlifting, or you're playing baseball and you're sprinting between two bases or sprinting to go catch the ball. These is where you're going to get the oxygen is supplied by the myoglobin in the muscles. So again, this is like hemoglobin in the bloodstream, but this is myoglobin in the muscles itself that carries oxygen for these quick supplies of energy. So we're going to make ATP by two ways using this phosphagen system. Either we are going to take two ADPs, right, and we're going to steal one of the P's from the ADP, to turn it into an ATP, right? Because ADP is 2 phosphoruses, ATP is 3. That's our one way of doing it. Or we can use this creatine phosphate and we can steal a P from that to give to an ADP to make more ATPs. And again, this is our immediate energy. And this is enough fuel for 1 minute of brisk walking or 6 seconds of sprinting. Not a lot of time, but enough that if you were in danger, you don't have to wait for your blood to bring oxygen to actually escape and get away. Does that make sense? This short term, we're talking about 30 to 40 seconds of maximum activity. And here's where we're going to have the muscle transition to anaerobic fermentation. Aerobic means with oxygen, right? Here we're going to make ATPs without oxygen. And if you remember us talking way back in the cell, that's very inefficient. We can do it, but it's very inefficient. With oxygen, we can make 22 to 24 ATPs from one little glucose. With fermentation here, you're talking about 2. So significant difference between aerobic and anaerobic. And the problem with anaerobic is that it converts that glucose into lactate. I'm sure you've heard of lactic acid in muscles that builds up. This is what that comes from, okay? From this anaerobic threshold, the place where we can actually detect the amount of lactate in your blood. The more that builds up, the more sore you get, the more difficulty the muscles have in firing. But again, this is how you're dealing with, again, that 30 to 40 seconds worth of again, hard maximum type activity.
So, just
Mm-hmm.
So, like, let's say you in an environment like how oxygen, like you're up in the mountain,
Mm-hmm.
really high. Would it be enough to like will your body be able to work on fermentation? Like, does it just for that 10 seconds or can you stick?
Right. For a small period of time, you're talking about less than a minute's worth of time. Yeah, you can deal with just that fermentation, the anaerobic fermentation. But without that, no. We can't produce enough. Like we're not efficient enough anaerobically to live without oxygen. We have to have it. There's no way around that. It's a good question. Long term, and this is what we talk about when folks doing cardio, right? Nobody does cardio for 40 seconds and then says, oh, I'm done. Okay, this is where we normally think of muscles getting their oxygen, because now finally the cardiovascular system has caught up, right? It can bring that increase in heart rate, the higher blood pressure, and bring more oxygen in the blood to the muscles, right? So you're not having to worry about doing it anaerobically. Now we've got plenty of oxygen, plenty of blood that's present, and we can make those ATPs. Make sense? Fatigue, when we say fatigue, that really comes from a couple of main reasons. And again, your textbook here lists a whole bunch of them, but if I boil them down into 2 steps, it's the accumulation of potassium and ADPs and phosphoruses, so they're not put together back into ATPs yet because we don't have the energy to do that. And also, number 2, we've lost the fuel that we need. We've lost the oxygen. We've lost the electrolytes. We don't have enough of that to keep the muscles firing. Because remember, you need the calciums, you need the potassiums in the muscle itself to do the work of contraction. So that's what's going to make you fatigued. There are other pieces that play into that, but those are the key pieces that I want you to be comfortable with. VO2 max is a measure of how much oxygen your body can use, how you can sustain these high intensity exercises. It's very cool to watch students. When I was in PT school, we actually did some testing of VO2 max, and a number of us and some of my colleagues did some research on this. And this is basically a way you can tell how fit a person is. You make them do maximum intensity running on a treadmill, usually is where this is done. And they're breathing through this mask thing that is measuring how much oxygen they're taking in and out. Somebody like you can be about a 45 or a 50 is a good VO2 max for someone your age. Someone my age is about 40. These elite athletes can be over 100. And so this is like somebody, I'm taking Lance Armstrong for an example. Bikers have huge VO2 maxes. Why? Because they're working aerobically all the time, right? They are just spinning and spinning and running and biking, and it's just, they need tons of oxygen to be delivered to their muscles. So what this is a measure of is how much oxygen can get carried to the muscles. Does that make sense? Not something you have to know, but worth mentioning to you. There's this whole section in your textbook about fast twitch versus slow twitch. I decided just to kind of go past that. There is some, I'm not going to say controversy, but it's not necessarily, the point is that some muscles will contract quicker, some will contract slower. The quicker ones tend to go for shorter periods of time, the slower ones go for longer periods of time. Not super, super important in my humble opinion. I have a little piece on your study guide about resistance training versus endurance training versus cross training. Are you comfortable that resistance is weightlifting, right? You're trying to grow those muscles, make them bigger. You're working for the power aspect, more anaerobic, right? Versus endurance, you're doing more aerobic, right? And really what we want is to have you have a combination of these two things. That's what cross training is meaning. You're not simply doing strength, you're not simply doing endurance, you're working both of those together. Last but not least, a little bit about cardiac and smooth muscle. The pieces I want you to know about cardiac muscle, of course, it's just in the heart. No other place that cardiac muscle is found. Its function is to pump blood, to move blood different places. It has what we call these intercalated discs, which are these little guys right there that differentiate it from the striated skeletal muscles, because these guys are striated. They do have stripes in them as well. They're non-voluntary. I can't say to you, please stop beating your heart. It won't work. It just keeps on beating, right? And it will contract without nervous stimulation. You don't need your brain to tell your heart to beat. There are actually cells in the heart that are called pacemaker cells that produce this electrical current to tell these muscles to fire. And thankfully, they are highly resistant to fatigue. They don't get tired very easily because it's literally pumping once a second, if not more than that, your entire life. Never takes a break. So cardiac muscles are pretty impressive. And again, there's a whole piece more there. You can check it out. Smooth muscle, what I want you to be comfortable with that is that smooth muscle is found in the walls of organs and blood vessels and airways to cause the contractions of these different pieces. They're non-voluntary as well. I can't tell you, digest your food or stop digesting your food. You can't control that. And they are very slow to contract and relax. They're not quick motion kind of things. These are some things that for the most part are very slow, very controlled. And the last thing I was going to mention, but I don't think it's on my PowerPoint here, is don't forget about that muscular systems connection piece that is there way back on page 427, looking at how the muscular system interacts with the other systems. Again, always, I think, a very key piece to not get stuck in your isolation. Don't think only about muscular system. Branch out to make sure you see how it interacts with the others. All right, thanks for being here.